Hey, I'm Drew Joseph, and in this video we're going to be looking at a 2800 plus rated puzzle on chess.com. I just spent a good chunk of time solving this one. I think it's going to be very instructive, and my goal is to show you how you can eventually, with a little bit of practice, start to solve these puzzles that are considered master level. I think that chess.com's puzzles are at this high level, maybe a little bit inflated in terms of rating. I'm certainly nowhere near 2800, but it feels good to solve them. And it's not as tricky as you think once you have some of the sort of thinking techniques built out. So let's have a look at this. I'm sure you're familiar with the Grandmaster move matrix, though maybe not the name, looking at checks, captures, starting from the queen down to the minors and pawns, and of course threats. So in this position, obviously no checks. These pieces can't get to the white king right yet, just yet, but obviously we have this battery and the potential for some shenanigans on this particular diagonal. Um, Black, one thing with these higher level puzzles is you often want to look at what black is threatening because it's less, oftentimes it's not just about finding the good moves yourself, it's about figuring out what black's best response is going to be. So in this position, black isn't really threatening anything in terms of our pieces, nothing's about to get trapped. There is this move, though we can always exchange the bishop, and this pawn is pinned anyway. We could take the rook. Other than that, it's not that black has a lot of threats in the position. That's good. It means that we mostly just have to be aware of how black is going to respond to our threats. Speaking of threats, there is this obvious move where we can attack the black queen. And that's where we're going to start, because there aren't a lot of places that the black queen can go. And more than that, then we're going to have a second attacker on this knight, and some potential, well, there's this potential fork. There are a lot of potential tactics. So let's look at what happens if we move the knight here. The white queen, again, probably not going to go to these squares. She wants to keep an eye on this c6 square, and the knight obviously can't go to this diagonal with our bishop. So really the only logical move that I can see is moving to c8. Right? This, not so tricky so far. Right? The next step would be, well, okay, if we're going to capture the knight, which way do we capture? Well, obviously by taking with the knight first. Pawn takes, we can recapture with the bishop, and we get this delightful fork. So this is where, say, if you're solving puzzles at, I don't know, the 50, 100, maybe even up to 2000 level, that's sort of where the tactic probably ends. The pieces are in such a position, you get that fork, you win a rook, or you win an exchange, and the puzzle's over. But for these puzzles, we have to be a little more careful and look at what is black's actual best move after our knight takes the black knight here on c6. And the big sort of learning jump or skill jump that I went through, I imagine a lot of players go through, is remembering that the pawn doesn't actually have to capture back. Black can come up with another response. Instead of capturing the knight, black can move this pawn forward, for example. There aren't really any other interesting moves, like you could sack a bishop, move it here, and attack the queen or something, but and then, okay, we capture the bishop, and he captures our bishop back. We are still up a knight, and we pull the knight out, I suppose. Something like that. I'm sorry, the arrows are insane. So it's like he can make a threat on our queen. We could capture that bishop. Yes, then he'd take our bishop, but now our knight evacuates, and we're just up a piece. So not the most viable. So again, we now have this knight has moved to c6, just for the sake of visualizing. What happens then if black pushes this pawn? One thing to note here, you may have looked at this in the original position and said, well, black can't actually capture this because there's this pin. We win a rook. Now the queen has gone back to c8. This is another thing about puzzles at this level, is a subtle change in position can change what tactics are and aren't possible. This pawn push wasn't possible from the starting position, it is possible as soon as the queen moves back. And that's something that would be very easy to miss. So I've captured this knight. Black pushes the pawn here. So we have we have 8 discovered checks. Right? The knight can move to any of these squares now. Well, okay, not this one. 7 potential squares that the knight can move to. So the question is, where should we put it? So if we bring the knight back to its original square, the knight is safe. We lose a bishop, and if our queen takes, well, black can just block with his queen, and then we've won a pawn, right? We've taken the black knight, black has taken our bishop, and we've recaptured the pawn, this pawn, right? So we're up a pawn, but that's not going to be good enough to solve a tactics puzzle. So other interesting moves would be, let's see, well, moving the knight here just gets the knight potentially taken. That's not great. The knight here, you have the queen and the king both looking at it. That also doesn't look great. But then if we get to this square, this is actually interesting because it breaks the coordination between the rook and the queen, meaning once again, this capture results in us being able to take the rook. And a thing to note, of course, is the knight is protected on this square by our bishop. That's pretty interesting. So that's a good candidate move, but what happens if black does not capture the bishop with the pawn? Then we have to look at, okay, well, black is in check. Black either has to capture the bishop or he has to move the king to one of these squares. And then it looks like we're going to have a bunch of checks. This is probably going to be hard to visualize, maybe a little hard to visualize. Remember, the queen is here. Our knight has come all the way to b8, and there's a pawn here. So, and of course, this piece hasn't been taken. So let's say the king goes to e7. Well, then we have a couple of checks that the queen can give. And then it looks like the king might end up shuffling, shuffling back and forth. We could give this check, king comes here. We can give this check, king comes here. So what we want to do here, there doesn't look like there's a mate in the position, but what we can do is extract this bishop. That's essentially what we're looking to do. The bishop is currently under attack by this pawn, and if he's going to move the king, well, then we're going to have an opportunity to extract the bishop to a4. So really the queen check, whether the king moves to d8 and we give a check on a5, or to e7 and we give a check on a3, that gives us the a4 square to extract the bishop. And then if, say, he attacks the bishop again, we can extract the bishop. The queen will be on one of these squares, the king will be on one of these squares. We can extract the white bishop. Our knight, yes, it's back here, but it can't be, it can be taken, and then we'll get 2 pieces for the rook, plus we'll have a knight, so it'll be a knight and a rook for a bishop and a knight, and we're essentially up in exchange. Hopefully that makes sense. Of course, I can show this on the analysis board, but let's actually see now with our eyes. So the pawn takes, and remember, knight going here creates those interesting options that this is no longer capturable. So here, and now, the easy solution, we didn't have to go through all the king checks, but if the pawn hadn't taken and he'd moved the king, remember we have a check on either of these squares, and then we can extract the bishop to a4. So simple solution, and there you have it. So let's actually take a look at the analysis board for a second and see what would happen. What would happen if black moved the king? So I can't take that, so that goes here. This check, and if black moves the king, and we give this check, you could block with the pawn just gets taken. Nothing interesting there. So king e7, now we extract the bishop. If black attacks that bishop, then we're able to bring it to safety. And that's that. And even if black takes this, just so you can see, we actually get this pawn at the end if we want it. And yeah, white is winning. So there we have it. Maybe a little complicated. Let me know what you think. Maybe it's if that was too easy, too hard, or somewhere in between. I know it can be tough visualizing with all the arrows, but it's a good skill to build, and it absolutely pays off. So let me know what you think, and I'll see you in another one soon.